Hey folks, today we're going to be talking about the photo mode for Chernobylite. There's a few intro things I need to take care of first, but if you're not interested in that whole spiel, just click on the timestamp, skip to where we go into the actual photo mode. Okay, so what's going on with this video? In the past, I've done photo mode reviews going over the technical features of each photo mode, but as I've been looking at more and more modes, they're all kind of similar. And while it's important and helpful to talk about the technical feature set of the photo mode in a video game, I think that is a helpful thing to do, it's just not very meaty. And actually the more interesting thing to talk about is the style and sort of creative decisions you can make in each different game. What I found trying a whole bunch of different games is that it feels a lot less like switching cameras, which is sort of how I was reviewing it. I was reviewing the feature set of photo modes as though they were cameras, and it feels more like genre switching. So what do I mean by that? Primarily I do landscape. So when I go and I do portrait photography or streetscape photography, it's a complete change for me in the style and the setup and the gear and how I look for photos. There's a lot more creative decisions switching between genres than there are between cameras. When I switch my camera, I just got to figure out where the ISO, aperture, and shutter speed are, and I'm mostly good to go. I think that analogy holds up for video games. Switching video games, the photo modes are pretty similar. There are more variations there, some different quirks to talk about. So the point is, the thing that I find most interesting to talk about is the style of photos and the creative decisions that are different between games, as opposed to just the technical review of the photo mode. So for the technical review, the photo mode is fine. I don't have a ton of complaints. The biggest complaint that I have is the UI. What you're seeing now on screen, if I've done the editing right, is me trying to struggle through the UI for one of the first times, getting used to it. The commands that the game lists at the bottom of the screen for what you can do, like move the camera or adjust, change when you go between moving the camera and changing the camera settings. You can't change the camera settings and move the camera at the same time like you can with a lot of games. It's tab to go back and forth, but if you press tab one too many times, you'll exit the photo mode and lose all your settings, which you're seeing me do right now. It was pretty frustrating to learn. But once you get through that, it's a perfectly fine photo mode. I think that's the biggest quirk. A few other things that are quirks that are actually kind of nice. You can change both the Chernobylite storm and the weather, so you can change it to sunny with a storm or fog with a fog storm if you really like fog. This is a very tree-like game, so we'll talk about this in a bit, but fog is great for the setting that we're in. You can take photos in the dream sequence or reconstruction areas, as they're called. You spend a lot of your time scanning your surroundings. Your scanner highlights different objects in the world. Those objects, when they're scanned, show up in the photo mode as scanned, which is kind of unfortunate. I don't think it should do that. It really stands out and doesn't look great. And also, unfortunately, the flashlight doesn't show up in photo mode. So the flashlight, which actually would provide a good source of lighting for photos, doesn't show up. So it's not clear to me what will and will not show up when you go to take photos. But for me, I just tried to avoid scanning when I know I'm about to take a photo. Let those scans go away, and just don't use your flashlight. It doesn't do anything. In terms of style and creative decisions, I really like Chernobylite. I do a lot of forest photography. Chernobylite is covered in forests that are good for forest photography. So I have really enjoyed just wandering around, looking for supplies, and taking pictures. That's where I've been finding most of my photos. You are going to see a lot of pretty similar stuff pretty quick. I think I've gone through all the areas, and they all are some variation of forest and dilapidated buildings, which if you want to take pictures of forests and dilapidated buildings, this is the place to do it. It works really well with all the fog I mentioned earlier. Because there is Chernobylite storm and weather settings, you can actually switch up the feeling of the scene pretty dramatically with that, which you'll see here. This was in a building. There was some sort of generator with some fog around it, and I changed the weather so that it was sunny with Chernobylite storms to sort of give it the lighting but also give it some fog. And for those who don't know, fog is really, really helpful for any type of photography. Well, maybe not any type of photography, but for woodland photography, it's great. One of the biggest problems with taking pictures of lots of trees that are like gray and brown and green, which everything in Chernobylite is gray and brown and green, is it's hard to distinguish the foreground from the background. When you're walking around, you have two eyes, so you see in stereo kind of, and you can make out that depth. But on a camera, since it's 2D, you can't make out the depth. So having fog or rain lowers the saturation of the background. This gives the illusion of depth. Not even the illusion. It generally is depth, but it makes the depth stand out more. So adding fog to a forest scene is a really good way to make your photo feel a bit more dynamic and give it a bit more depth. So I almost always use fog when I am doing stuff in Chernobylite. I think the other thing that I generally do when I take my pictures is crank the saturation up. I crank the saturation up and normally contrast and brightness too, just to like give it a little more pop. I don't know why. It feels more saturated when I play the game than it does in the photo. I don't think it actually is more saturated in-game when I'm playing it. I think maybe it's just something to do with the fact that I'm interacting and things are moving that makes it feel more saturated, but for me, turning up the saturation actually feels a bit more natural when I'm taking a photo, so I recommend doing that. You can move the camera any distance from the player that you want, so when you're out there taking photos and you see a scene that you're like, hey, I could take a picture of that, go ahead and enter photo mode wherever you are, and you can probably get there. There is a boundary, but it's pretty far away. So if you're like at the bottom of a building and want to go to the top, you can probably do it in photo mode. You don't have to actually climb the building. Puddles in water do have reflections. I didn't make a ton of use of it. There's still a lot to be done there, I think. So that is one thing to explore. They were pretty good. Like you can make out trees in the reflection when you look at puddles and things like that. So do keep that in mind if you want to do like an inverse shot in like body of water or puddle. You can totally do that here. The other big thing to make note of is, the flashlight does not show in your photos, but the character also doesn't. So you're not going to be taking any portrait photos in this one unless you're taking them of enemies. I'm not even sure enemies show up, so take that advice with a grain of salt. But yeah, your character definitely does not show up. So this is generally going to be a game where you're going to be taking landscape photos, which with the weather settings and the fog, I think makes a lot of sense. The text, the overlay that you can put that says like Chernobylite, the stamp that you can put on your photos looks fine, goes well with all the format and stuff. So definitely feel free to use that. It does sometimes make the photo look better. You have just kind of a background landscape photo, you can put the name of the game on it. Other than that, my general strategy is just go out hunting for supplies as part of the game and looking for photo ops as I go hunting for supplies and wander around through the forests. So that's my take on Chernobylite. Overall, it's a pretty good photo mode. It has some quirks that I think it could do without, but the landscape photography and woodland photography here is probably one of the best games for that. So 2 thumbs up in that department, even though it's lacking in a few others. I also should mention I had a hard time running this. My computer, I had to turn down some of the graphics, so it is graphically intensive. So don't take this game if your computer isn't beefy enough to run it. Definitely check the specs first. All right, thanks for watching and hope you enjoy.